Cross question tonight are Craig Whittaker, Conservative MP for Calder Valley and a former Deputy Chief Whip in the government of Liz Truss. Luciana Berger is with me, Chair of the Maternal Mental Health Alliance and a former Labour Change UK and Liberal Democrat MP. James Heale is here, Diary Editor of The Spectator, also co-author of the book Out of the Blue, the inside story of the unexpected rise and rapid fall of Liz Truss. And Zack Polanski joins me too, the Deputy Leader of the Green Party of England and Wales and a member of the London Assembly. Get your questions coming in. Lots coming in already. There are some slots left though. 0345 6060 973, the number to call. You can text your question to 84850 or tweet us at LBC.
0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question. Watch on Global Player. This is LBC.
Lots of questions coming in already. Let's start tonight with Denise in Tooting. Denise, hi.
Hi. Hello, guys. Hi, Ben. How are you?
Hi. What's your question to the panel, Denise?
Basically, it's what would they do in order to reverse the effects of the austerity that the nurses have been dealing with for the last 12 years? What would they do to reverse that? Any
particular area, Denise, you're thinking about there, or just generally?
Basically, they've had to deal with the austerity and the pay cuts and the hours worked and everything that they've had to deal with over the last 12 years of Conservative rule. But what they're going for their pay rise now for other reasons other than just being a pay rise. But it seems the government or the Conservative government are not seeing the reasons behind it.
Got you, Denise. Thank you. I think we've got your question there. Pay rises, Craig. NHS workers, public sector workers suffered years and years of real terms pay cuts. Your government's not reversing those. Why not?
Well, it's not just NHS workers. It's the whole of the UK economy. Anybody in the workforce has seen a real term cut for many years going forward. The problem now, of course, is that we see inflation at such a high rate. And it's like everything in life. You can have whatever you want, but it's got to be paid for. And the reality is and I understand what Denise says, that, this isn't just about that, the trying to make a point. But the reality is, you've got to pay for it. And we just don't have the money to do so.
£10 billion to give NHS nurses, NHS workers the pay rise they want. You found $400 billion during the pandemic. You spent $37 billion on NHS tests and trace. It's a question of priorities, isn't it?
No, it's a question of how much do you borrow, because all that £500 billion has been borrowed and it has to be paid back. And it's the same thing with this. £10 billion for nurses. It's billions for other sectors. It's not just nurses. It's teachers. It's MPs. It's the whole of the civil service. How do you fund that? If you want to fund it by borrowing more, then go ahead and do it. But somebody at some point has got to pay it back.
Zack.
Craig was in Liz Truss's government and he's learnt the wrong lessons here. Borrowing is not a bad thing if you are using it to fund investment, particularly green investment. Borrowing is a bad thing if you're using it to fund unfunded tax cuts. What we really need here is a wealth tax, a 1% tax on the richest 1%. That's for start. There's lots of other things I'd like to do, but the University of Greenwich have shown that if you do a 1% tax on the 1%, the Green Party wealth tax, that would raise £75 billion a year.
Oh, that's if they stay.
Well,
that's
also,
if the wealthy stay.
Well, I'm glad you asked me that too, Craig, because also you put a tax on people who leave, and that's also if 50% of people left, which is overestimating it. So it's clear that there is money left, and we saw that, as you've just presupposed, with your question. We saw that in COVID. We saw Nightingale hospitals pop up everywhere, and that was good. We saw universal credit uplifted by £20. That was good. Those were political choices, and I'll applaud a political choice when it's the right political choice. Right now, we have political choices that are toxic, that are divisive, that are turning people against each other. We hear as if the workers is some amorphous blob that we don't understand. We're all the workers. The public are the workers. And it's really important that every single person in this country stands by these people who are striking. Because we know in the Green Party, unlike the other parties, unfortunately, and I do include Labour in this, that when people ask for solidarity, the only authentic response is to give it.
Luciana. Labour been in a pretty, robust row today about positions on strikes. Keir Starmer was treating effectively refusing to say what they would do on public sector pay. Isn't that a bit of a cop-out from your old party? One of your own parties.
It's a point well made. I'm not a member of any party, so I'm not here speaking on behalf of anyone. I think it's important that we look at the backdrop of how we've got to where we are today. We're seeing the fastest drop in real wages on record. And that's across all sectors, but more pronounced in the public sector. And it's also exacerbated by the fact that we have a really severe recruitment and retention crisis, again, across all of the public sector. And if we look specifically at the NHS, for example, the research that we saw out today from Labour, hospitals paying upwards of £5,000 for one shift for one locum doctor. It's completely absurd and ridiculous, and we just don't have the people because we haven't treated our public sector workers, particularly in the NHS, very well. And yet we all stood outside and applauded them when it came to the pandemic, but actually, there is a serious challenge, and these are the people on the front line, our key workers, who are doing everything to keep this nation well, particularly when we're experiencing in this winter additional challenges like strep A, for example. So ultimately, it's incumbent on the government to get around the table. And I was really disappointed to read on the way here that there hasn't been able to be a proper resumption of discussions today when it comes to our nurses who do such an important job, because as I understand it, the health secretary didn't want to talk about wages today. Obviously, that's kind of the crux of the issue, but it's not just about that, and we're not hearing about those wider issues. And it's not just about this moment in time. Obviously, people are feeling it in such a pronounced way when we've got inflation, food inflation at over 16%. This is as a result of years and years of essentially kind of just wearing down our public services, wearing down our health service, and this is why we're in such a profound and challenging situation at this time. And I'm really disappointed to hear what's happened today with the government.
What do you make of Keir Starmer and Wes Streeting sort of taking on the unions a bit, and they won't give in to their vested interest, their demands, banning shadow ministers from standing on the picket lines? It's a clear shift from Labour leaders of old. Is it a sensible one, do you think?
Well, I reflect specifically what the comments were that I read from the Shadow Health Secretary, from Wes Streeting, specifically about the issue around primary care. So this is a discussion about a vote that was passed about whether we should confine the opening hours of our GPs to between 9 and 5. I think there is a discussion to be had about whether that's sensible.
Calling the British Medical Association, which is the doctors' trade union, calling them vested interest groups and they're being too dogmatic. Is that what people want to hear from Labour politicians?
I think that there's vested interest in all groups, but I think there's a really important and profound conversation to be had about how we shift what we have at the moment within our health service, which is a focus on what happens in hospitals, to bring everything back into the community, to preventing ill health in the first place, to making sure that people can access GP appointments. I was in my office today. One of my co-workers was on the phone for like over 20 minutes just trying to get through to her GP to make an appointment, and when she did so, she wasn't going to get one until the new year. So I think there's a discussion to be had with everyone about how we improve our health service, and it's everyone's business. It's not just the government's business. But at this time, what's the most important thing, what I'm hearing very clearly and very loudly from Labour, is that it's the government's responsibility to get around the table, and that's not what we're seeing at this time.
James?
Yes, well, I think that, go back to Denise's original question, I mean, the difficulty here is two issues, I think. One is low pay since the post-2008, and the other is inflation. And inflation, of course, makes everything scratchy, turns different employee groups against each other. Inflation running at 10% eats into people's wages. So I think the danger here, the question here is about how do we solve these longer-term issues facing the country, and we've already got difficult choices ahead of us in the sense that the tax burden's at a 70-year high. People, I think, are paying a lot for in terms of spending, but not getting results from public services. And so I think the longer-term question here on both sides is about growth. And the tragedy, I think, as Zack mentions, the Liz Truss government, is that perhaps she had this focus on growth, but the solutions were wrong. And I think that, or perhaps mismanaged, shall we say. And I think that that's the key question that's going to be focusing over the next medium to long-term period once we get through the short to medium term of these strikes that are affecting the country in December and January.
Craig, I want to put that point to you about the Truss government you were part of. As Zack said, you found tens of billions of pounds to be borrowed to fund tax cuts, national insurance, corporation tax. £10 billion to be borrowed in that context to help nurses and the NHS through the winter. It's not much money, is it?
It's apples and pears. I mean, if you're funding short-term for growth, so invest to save, then that's exactly what the intention was, at least under the Truss government. This is a £10 billion year-on-year spend, which grows every year because next year's rise will be on top of this year's rise as well. So, that's not investing to save in the same way as investing for growth for the whole economy, which in effect would produce the money to pay the £10 billion.
But isn't part... Go on, Luciana.
And I was going to say, if that's just looking at the figure in isolation of just one figure without looking at all the other factors around it. I mean, I can think of many factors, in terms of, putting pay to one side and looking at this issue of recruitment and retention. If we don't invest in our nurses, they're going to stop being nurses. We're already seeing that. We've got over 100,000 vacancies in NHS, of which tens of thousands are in the nursing sector specifically.
We have, but that is because of the way the NHS currently sits. We've actually got more people working in our NHS now than we've ever had working.
Temporary contracts.
No, it doesn't matter whether they're temporary or not. The reality is they are working.
The people who are waiting
they
for
are
ambulances
working in the
hours on end
NHS.
who aren't receiving
But
a
that's
service.
not, if you look at all the support services, if you look at the decimation of health visitors, if you look at the reduction in people that are working in our communities to keep people well in the first place.
Let's get our doctors open 7 days a week so that actually people can go and see the doctors, so they're not going to A&E and putting more stuff on the
we've
on the
got
thing.
a massive GP recruitment crisis.
Let's sort out our social care.
We need 10,000
so
more
that
GPs.
we're not bed blocking with those people that should be going back out in the community to care. This isn't a one silver bullet fixes everything.
And that point about social care is because we've seen a decimation in the investment in social care in this country over the past 10 years. We don't have the people that are going into people's homes to support them. We're not having councils able to afford to provide the lower level of support.
But we're also spending more on social care than we ever have in our history. We've seen more monetary investment than we've ever seen in my lifetime in social care.
Can I suggest one policy which I think is a really exciting moment? This is the idea of a 10-to-1 pay ratio. I just did a political slot about this on Channel 4, which is no one in any organisation should be paid 10 times more than the lowest paid worker. And I think what we're seeing this on the railways as well, is we're seeing workers whose wages are going down in terms of real terms, and we're seeing executives and bosses taking huge amounts in dividends and in pay. And I think it's clear that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. I think under the Tory government, we've seen champagne at the top, sewage for the rest of us. We've literally got rivers that are running with...
Oh, come on.
Well, it's true. Even the Environment Agency say...
To be fair, I think that people have something to say about the £12 million in dividends that went out to Avanti shareholders yesterday, which is the worst performing operator in this country. I mean, there is some examples of where...
Right, and is there sewage in the water or not? Sorry, you're getting it on both sides, but there is sewage in our
there's
rivers.
always been sewage in our water. But
It's been much worse.
Our rivers are much cleaner now than they've been in my lifetime.
That's just
and
absolutely
I'm older
not
than
true.
you. No, it is true.
And
we even have a seal that sits on the buoy outside the House of Commons in the Thames. That would never happen 20 years ago.
The Environment
30
Agency,
years
who
ago,
are a government agency, I chair the Environment Committee in London, talk about the state of London's rivers, and we know that they're some of the better rivers sometimes.
So you're saying our rivers are not cleaner than they've been for many, many years?
I'm saying that we've got urgency and a crisis going on.
Are you saying our rivers are not cleaner than they've been for many years?
Yes, we have sewage issues all over the UK in our rivers, and it's not right that we have sewage in the rivers.
We started talking about nurses, we finished talking about seals. I don't know how we got there. More on strikes in just a moment. Keep your questions coming in. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:17.
LBC.
At Specsavers, if we said you can
Conversation. Cross question. Tweet at LBC.
8:19 at the time. Just a reminder, with me here in the studio are Zack Polanski from the Green Party, the Conservative MP Craig Whittaker, former Liberal Democrat Change UK and Labour MP Luciana Berger, and diary editor of The Spectator, James Heale. Mark has texted another question about strikes and pay. We will move on, but Mark's question's important too. Mark says, does the panel agree that nurses and other public sector workers should be offered a flat rate pay rise based on 10% of median earnings? I think this would help those on lower incomes, says Mark. Luciana, is that a good idea?
I do think that more needs to be done to help those that are at the lower end of the pay scales. Certainly we know that's the case for many people in the NHS that are just starting out, are training, or in their kind of earlier years, often doing some of the hardest jobs on the front line in the NHS. I think any agreement that can be reached that can disproportionately positively support those people on the lower pays, particularly when we're hearing some really challenging stories about how people are having to choose this Christmas whether they pay for their housing costs or whether they put food on the tables and going out with them and going without meals, and that's millions of people. Then yes, absolutely, we should tackle the scourge of low pay and make sure that people are earning a proper living wage rather than what's called a living wage but isn't a living wage according to the Living Wage Foundation. So I would definitely support that. In order to be able to achieve that, everyone needs to get around the table, and again, obviously we talked about it just a moment ago, but it's incumbent on government to lead the way and bring people together and have that discussion and negotiation on pay, and we've established already so far that that's not the case when it comes to our nurses striking this Thursday.
Mark's talking about 10% of median incomes. That sounds like a pretty hefty pay rise to me, possibly even bigger than the 19% that nursing unions are asking for. Why is 19% unaffordable, Craig?
Well, it's massively over and above a very high inflation rate to start with, which is difficult. I'm more in favour personally. I'll just go back to what Zack said earlier on. If you give nurses a 19% pay rise, then you've got to give doctors a 19% pay rise, and that disproportionately grows the wage gap. Which is unacceptable. This is my view on what should happen, not Conservative Party or indeed the government's view, but I think there's a very strong case for doing a one-off payment for the lower paid, particularly a little bit like we're doing with the winter fuel payments
within the NHS or
public sector, because
public
it's not just the NHS that has poorly paid people. As a proportion of the workforce. So I think there's a real, we need to have a real good solid look at doing something as a one-off, so then it doesn't, build up as time progresses as well.
Do you think Steve Barclay, in that case, is wrong to say, the Health Secretary, that he's not even going to enter in discussions with the unions about pay?
This is where I disagree with Luciana, because it's not for the government to enter into those discussions. That's why we have an independent pay review body. It's not just for nurses, but for a whole raft of civil servants. And that's very, very important, that you have that independence that makes recommendations to government. Government, of course, don't have to take on those recommendations.
Well, they've ignored them before, haven't they?
They have.
So Steve Barclay could do the same.
He could do, but he hasn't done. And what he's done is he's taken on fully what the independent pay review body has suggested. And I think that's, once you start getting into, you basically sideline. The whole point of having an independent pay review body is to negotiate between government and the sector. So I think Steve on this occasion is doing absolutely the right thing.
James, the politics of this, these strikes that we're going to see getting pretty close to a general strike in the coming weeks, millions of workers expected to walk out. How big a problem do you think that could pose for the government politically?
It's a good question. I think that this government particularly came in under Rishi Sunak and states its reputation on competence and being, I think, much more return to normality. So I think that does pose some kind of challenge. I think the question, though, that I think that Craig sort of touches upon is, I think, the politicians talk about the independent pay review body, and I think there's a reluctance here for politicians of both sides to kind of get involved with the nitty-gritty of independent individual, because then you start negotiating between politics and the independent sectors. And I think Labour have had this holding line about not refusing to be drawn into detail, so they refused to say they back 19%, but it would somehow be sort of higher than 7.5%. And I think that shows a kind of reluctance, really, to get too involved. Partly because Labour needs to sort of distance itself from some of the recent past about its links to unions, but also I think that the Tories, I think there's a much more softly approach than perhaps we saw maybe 30 years ago, of course, from the famous 80s, when it was about the authority of the state which is at stake. So although it is a lot of strikes at any one time, I would say it's a bit different from perhaps a general strike in that I don't think it's necessarily so much a political question as an economic one.
Thank you. Zack, is 19% unaffordable, as Keir Starmer says?
I think anything's affordable when it becomes your priority. So when the GMB asked for a 15% pay rise, I was really pleased that the Green Party backed that. Ultimately, though, I think this is about leadership, and it is about the government getting around the table. But we've seen this government, they're out of ideas, they're out of touch, and they're out of time. But also the Labour opposition, we've had Keir Starmer saying that governments in waiting don't go on picket lines. I've been really proud to be out and about on picket lines almost every day during some of these strikes. And the reason why I've been doing that is not that it's performative, but actually, if you're a government in waiting or you're any elected politician, it is your duty to be there to listen to people. And the idea that someone who is going to be a future government can't spend the time listening to the people who are out there making our country work, who are out there.
You don't have to be on the picket line to listen to people. There's so many ways in which MPs and shadow ministers and leaders engage, whether it's going to conferences, whether it's meeting your own constituents. All the work that has to be done in Parliament is getting out and speaking in the media. I mean, there's plenty of raft of things.
I agree entirely. So all of those things are important, and any politician should be doing those. Being on a picket line with people who are in a very particular context, who want to see politicians and speak to them in that context, is a really important part of the democratic process. And we've seen this Conservative government are rolling back the rights for union strikers, along with their awful protest rights and criminalising our right to essentially express ourselves. And the Labour Party should be front and centre defending those rights, but actually they've been completely missing off the table. So I'm really pleased once again that the Green Party, that we are out there on the picket lines and we're there to defend people's rights. That's not all of politics, but it's a really important part of politics.
I just reinforce, I'm not here on behalf of any party, but I'm certainly hearing from the Labour Party some very practical ideas about how they generate the income necessary to pay for things like increased pay for nurses. That takes time and energy, kind of in terms of working on the policy behind the scenes. There's loads of things that are going on. I think the idea that you have to be there on the picket line, I mean, there's certainly MPs that are, but the idea that in itself kind of it shows your solidarity with workers. It's coming out with the practical ideas and having the kind of innovation and thought and policy that's actually going to make a difference to this country, which at least we are hearing from the opposition, which we're certainly not hearing from government at this time.
Well, I think it's both. It's not either or. So you both create the practical ideas like insulate every home in Britain, make sure we're investing in renewables, make sure that we're making that green, fair transition with all industries, and it's being out there on the picket lines. It's not either or. You can do both. And that's what the Labour Party seem to not get. They seem to think that if you're on the picket line, you can't be doing serious politics. Picket lines are a really important part of our democratic process, and we should always be there to stand up for them.
Just Craig, briefly, Zack says you're, what was it, out of touch, out of time, out of ideas?
Well,
like that.
just for the record, and just to back Luciana up on this one, I mean, in a couple of weeks' time, I'm going to go do an overnight shift in A&E, my local A&E. That's how I stay in touch with what my constituents feel about various parts of the sectors. Last Friday, I was out. I visited 6 different businesses and high street businesses. There's a whole variety of things. So no, we're not.
This is brilliant, but maybe you should go visit a picket line too. I'm sure they'd love to hear.
Yeah, I'm sure that'll be.
Have you ever been on a picket line, Craig?
No, I don't think I have.
Ever?
No.
First time now?
No.
No?
No.
No plans?
No.
Okay.
I could just put on Twitter and then see what a picket line's like. I mean, it's the same thing. He who shouts loudest gets supposedly heard. And that's what I would...
It's the opposite. On picket lines, I'm not talking about the shouting. I'm talking about you can genuinely go and engage with people, ask them why they're there.
Yeah, but just say politicians don't engage with people is just ridiculous.
I never said that. I said that's a way of engaging with people. It's a really important
it is a way, but it is a way you choose, but I don't.
Right.
I think what we're also hearing from the opposition, in which we're not hearing from government, is how they would get around the table. I think that's an important starting point, which would make a very significant change. What we're not hearing from the Labour Party and that we are hearing from government is about calling up the army to somehow kind of replace public services. That's not what the army's in place for.
But what are they meant to do, Lucia? Someone's got to drive the ambulances. If paramedics go on strike, isn't it better to have the army there helping out?
We shouldn't be getting to that point.
And they're doing on 2 or 3 days training. It's not appropriate.
I mean, that's not...
No, come on. There are people in our army army that are qualified paramedics, doctors,
But our army's
nurses,
not.
and all those.
Our army is not trained to stand at our borders and our airports and check people's passports.
Well, we're talking about ambulances here. My daughter was in the army and did exactly just that. So to say she's not qualified or trained, like all the other people that work in that sector in the army, is just pure ridiculous.
Well, I don't think it's ridiculous. I think the point is that our public services should be run by the people who are there to do that.
Well, you were saying they weren't trained, is what you said.
Well, I'm saying that
and you said they only get 3 days training. That's not true.
Keep misrepresenting me. There will be people
that's what you said.
who are driving ambulances who aren't necessarily trained. I didn't say none of them are trained. Of course, you will get some people who are trained, and I hope they're the first to step forward. But there will be people, if the military come forward, doing jobs that are not fully trained to do those jobs, who will do a 2-3 day training course, be doing a vital job, and that's not appropriate. That's a government that's failed.
Craig, is it just briefly, is it a bit embarrassing that the government's having to call in the army to do all sorts of jobs because public sector workers have gone on strike?
I don't think it's embarrassing at all. I think, there has to be some, recognition that some of the demands that are being asked for are just, unaffordable. And like I said to start with, you can ask for whatever you can have whatever you want.
But how does
but you've got to pay for it.
It's a negotiation. You obviously have two ends of respect.
Well, that's why we have the independent pay review bodies that do exactly just that.
How does this end, though, unless the government is willing to concede in some areas? Is this just going to go on?
Well, there will be some concessions at some point along the way. Of course there will be.
So why not just get them out the way earlier and avoid a lot of chaos?
Well, I'm not. It's way above my pay grade to start negotiating on behalf of the government. I'm not even, a government minister. But those discussions will be being had behind the scenes, and there's a whole variety of things. But I go back to what I said. I don't think it is the government's role to sit around a table with a particular sector to negotiate. That's exactly why you have the independent pay review bodies. If you bypass that system, you actually get a democratic system that breaks down.
Okay, James, just very briefly.
Can I just say, I do think it's the government's responsibility to ensure that we preserve life. And when it comes to the NHS and there's already 7 million people waiting for an operation in this country, and the fact that people will not be able to get an ambulance in the way that they should be doing, and they're not doing it so already, and that's what's going to be happening. I think, again, that is the responsibility of the government to step up and engage in negotiating.
James, just briefly, do you think ministers are going to have to cave on this at some point to put an end to the chaos that we're going to see?
I mean, I think there'll be some kind of concessions along the way, and I think it'll be very difficult. I think the key thing is difference between, say, NHS workers, which I think the public has a lot more empathy and sympathy with after the pandemic than other sectors, perhaps. So I think it'll be interesting to see if that changes, whether the overall public perceptions will change as well.
Can I agree with Craig on something, because we piled on him? A one-off payment, not a one-off payment, but let's have a universal basic income. Let's protect some of the poorest people in society.
That's not agreeing.
Well, you said a one-off payment.
You can't say you agree and then propose a totally different policy. It's right.
It's very creative.
Lots more to come on this. Do keep your questions coming in. 03456060973. More to come in just a moment. First, let's get the latest news headlines from Serena Farrow.
The Royal College of Nursing says the Health Secretary refused to discuss pay demands during talks earlier. General Secretary Pat Cullen says she expressed her deep disappointment, adding Steve Barclay had little to say ahead of this week's strikes. No one else has been reported missing following the deaths of 3 boys who fell through a freezing lake near Birmingham. A 4th boy, who's 6 years old, is still in a critical condition in hospital. And a lab technician's been found guilty of the murder of his work colleague at his parents' home in Leicestershire. 30-year-old Ross McCullum had admitted the manslaughter of Megan Newborough, claiming he suffered from undiagnosed PTSD. LBC weather staying mainly dry for Wales and most of England tonight. The odd shower in Northern Ireland, though, with a low of at least -7 degrees.
This is LBC. Last question on LBC. Text 84850.
8:35 the time now. Ben Kentish here on LBC. Joining me in the studio for tonight's cross question are Craig Whittaker, Conservative MP for Calder Valley, Luciana Berger, Chair of the Maternal Mental Health Alliance, and of course former MP, James Heale, the diary editor of The Spectator and co-author of the book Out of the Blue, and Zack, the deputy leader of the Green Party of England. Right, our next
Wales.
question. And Wales. I've demoted
You'll
you,
get
Zack.
sweeted.
Apologies. Let's go to our next questioner, who is Jake in Orpington. Jake, good evening.
Hi, yeah, good evening, Ben. Thank you for taking my call, and good evening, panel. Having slept on the streets for 4 years, and with the cold snap that we're having now, what is being done for the homeless people? Because there seems to be a lot of talk about everybody, me, I want, and I totally get it. But what's actually being done for the homeless people? Because I've done a little bit of looking into it, and there's no sort of night shelters that are being opened up, and I know there's warm hubs during the day, but I'm talking about the weather that's going on out there at the moment, and it's going to get colder before it gets better. And what's being done for the homeless people, basically.
Jake, I'm glad you asked it. We're going to be talking about it in a lot more detail from 9, but it's a really important issue. Zack, big issue in London. You're a London Assembly member. What is being done and what more needs to be done in your view?
It's a huge issue, and no one should have to spend any night either asleep on the street or even couch surfing. And lots of people who are homeless don't necessarily get counted in the statistics because we know there's lots of overcrowding going on and all sorts of other practices. Essentially, what we need to do is make sure that there are enough homes for everyone. And I know that sounds like a really obvious statement, but sometimes I think in these conversations, those things get missed. So there's a few key things there. When we say enough homes for everyone, the home has to be of a decent standard. We're in a cost of living crisis, and we know that if your home isn't insulated, then your energy bills are rocketing. The cheapest bill is essentially the one you don't have to pay because you've got an insulated home. So we need to make sure in those places where we are building more homes or where we're retrofitting homes that we're doing it properly and to a decent standard. One thing we've been doing a lot of in London, and we need to stop immediately, is knocking down homes and putting new buildings up there, but often the buildings are unaffordable. One, that's really bad for embodied carbon. That's for carbon within the building, so that's terrible for the environment because you're destroying it, sending all those carbon emissions and then rebuilding a home. But second, it's actually a complete lack of imagination. In Paris, there's been some really interesting pieces of work recently architecturally where they've taken old estates and things like that, retrofitted them, made them more beautiful, and actually put more people into them. So I think we need a really different attitude to the way that we get homes for people. And then finally, you can't have this conversation without talking about Margaret Thatcher's failed policy and the fact that we sold off all of those council homes. Essentially, social housing has to be there for everyone, has to be provided. And I know that there'll often be talks about long waiting lists, but again, that's often pitting the most vulnerable people against the most vulnerable people. We need to have a positive story about migration, positive story about refugees and asylum seekers, and make sure the infrastructure is there. That means homes, doctors, infrastructure and transport. All of those things can happen, and when people say they can't or they're unaffordable, once again, that's a result of political choices, and everyone having a home to live in has to be a fundamental human right.
Craig, is that the right approach? Craig Whittaker?
The one thing I will agree with Zack on is the fact that actually you have, before we can have a sensible conversation about all the things that he said, you have to have a decent infrastructure, and infrastructure doesn't come overnight. So that's the first thing. And the people we're talking about, those that are sleeping on the streets, aren't the ones that want council houses. What they need is incredible amounts of help, whether it's mental health, whether it's from drug abuse, alcoholism, whatever it is. If you go and talk to the people on the streets in London, as I do, and indeed in other parts, what they need is real help. There is a long-term strategy from the government on homelessness. And in fact, if you're a vet and homeless, the aim is to have all vets off the streets by 2024. But it's not that simple. That needs a whole heap of determination, money. We're not talking about homes. We're talking about shelters to start with, because we've got to get them physically off the streets first.
Right.
I mean, you can't take them physically off the streets in some of the states that they're in and put them straight into a council house, for example. What we need is shelters for them. There aren't enough shelters around London, and this is your responsibility, being a London Assembly.
It's my responsibility to scrutinise the mayor, so it's the mayor's responsibility.
But look, you're a London. You can't. You know, as politicians, you can't beat up somebody when you're part of that process For not me, Gov, it's somebody else.
Actually, the London Assembly is a scrutiny body, so it's a different body to what you do, which is a legislative
No, I understand that, but
I take my responsibility seriously.
But we all have to take responsibility. Okay, all right, but we all have to take responsibility for it. It's not about building council houses. It's in the longer term, it is, but in the short term, what it is about getting those people off the streets and into refuges and getting them the help they need, whether it's mental health, whether it's for alcohol.
But the outcome here isn't to have everyone in refuges. The outcome here is to have everyone in a home.
Longer term. But short term, let's get them off the street to start with.
Absolutely, but then let's get them in the home.
But you can't do that in London if you don't have refugees, and you don't have refugees to help.
Craig, would you agree that we're not building anywhere near enough homes to solve this problem in the long run?
Oh, it's a huge problem, and we go back to what we were saying before. You know, the government have been, I'd go as far as saying, with particular private landlords, they've been anti-private landlords for 15, 20 years. If you go and talk to your Citizen Advice Bureau locally, as I did a couple of weeks ago in the Calder Valley, number 2 on their problem is landlords selling homes. They want to get out of being private landlords because it's just not worth doing. So they're selling these homes. So there's actually less homes for people to rent. Our councils aren't building homes. Our social housing aren't building enough homes. And the problem is getting worse, not better. I mean, why do you think we had to have, the homes for Ukrainians? Because we have no homes to put them. Why do you think we have 143,000 young men in hotels in virtually every constituency in the Calder Valley, in the country, not just the Calder Valley, that are waiting to be processed because we don't have homes to put them in?
You've been in government for the last 12 years.
No, but this isn't a 12-year issue. This is an ongoing situation that you have to have the infrastructure in place before you can deal with these things.
You did say it's getting worse, not better, Craig.
Well, it is.
Under your government.
It is getting worse. But, under the last Labour government, they didn't build any social housing at all. In fact, they ripped it all down.
So they started it and you've done nothing about it. Is that basically
it? No, we have built, but we don't build enough. And you've got to strip it back. You've got to go back to things like the planning system, which is appalling. And it takes forever to get a small extension, let alone build a state of social housing.
Luciana.
It's a very timely discussion point because there's the crisis research out today that shows that an additional 1 million people are facing eviction from their homes this winter. So we already see on our streets the stain, I think it's a stain on a national conscience to see the increase in people that are sleeping on our streets. And I've been in a number of cities just over the course of the past few months and seen for myself the very visible increase in the visible homelessness, and that doesn't include people that, as we've heard, either in a crowded accommodation or sofa surfing, don't perhaps come under the official statistics of homelessness, but are really struggling to get by. So I don't want to live in a country where we're seeing increasing numbers of homeless people. I want us to be able to do something to make sure that we don't see that, particularly in these acute cold winter months. There's some very practical things that the government can do. They could ensure that every area gets the direct funding to contend with a challenge in individual cities. That isn't the case at the moment. Certainly, where I was an MP in Liverpool, the Liverpool City Council did everything that it possibly could to uphold the no second night policy, that no one should be sleeping a second night rough on the streets. But again, that was doing it on a shoestring. And despite, so many people's best efforts kind of relying on charity and volunteers, and there just wasn't enough resource. And part of the challenge has also been kind of the disproportionate impact on those areas with higher levels of deprivation, where we've seen councils who are at the forefront of dealing with this issue not being, just not having the funds to be able to contend with it. So it's not just about money, and there are kind of wider societal and social challenges and issues, but it's very, very visible. And again, I think people want a government that's going to tackle it and actually do something, and not just say, the numbers are rising, but actually do everything to eliminate it altogether.
James, what do you think needs to be done?
Well, I mean, I was going to say, I think that, this winter with the snow today, I wonder if that will be one thing with political potency that's going to cut through, is seeing those images of people homeless in this kind of weather. But I was just reflecting on, I remember at the start of the pandemic, there was a great effort to try and get some of the homeless into more sort of permanent shelters. And it's just a shame that, understandably, for kind of political bandwidth and the focus of Westminster sort of moved on elsewhere. It's just a shame. And I think that shows that the kind of short-term investment isn't enough, and that often it's the pressure elsewhere in the system. Really long-term is the planning system and housing, but also things like the NHS, etc. And those kind of pressures get put on the front line. People end up homeless. And honestly, I think, was his name John? Sorry, my sympathies. James. Sorry, my sympathies this Christmas time.
Okay, Jake, thank you for your question. James in Ayrshire is next. James. What's your question? Hi.
Good evening, Ben, and good evening to your guests. My question is a very short one. Will there ever be any meaningful reform of the House of Lords?
Will there ever be any meaningful reform of the House of Lords? Luciana Berger, should there be?
Should there be? I mean, there's a suite of policies that any new government might want to look at to improve politics standing in this country, and it's fair to say that it has been decimated over recent years. And I see a report out today that shows a proportion of the public want to see more to hold politicians to account and to hold them to the standards that you expect of them in office.
Do you think it serves a function, the House of Lords, in its current form?
I certainly, from my experience of serving in the House of Commons for just shy of 10 years, reflect very positively on some of the experts who are currently in the House of Lords and the really important job that they do, bringing their expertise of decades in the sectors that they've come from to scrutinise our legislation. That is a separate issue to the fact that we've seen recent governments literally ram it full of people that are their friends and their mates, and to swell the ranks to make sure that there isn't any proper, I think, scrutiny, or that there's no chance of, certainly if I reflect on the difference between the government in 2010 and towards the, what we see today, that there wasn't the opportunity to have those meaningful votes that could result in actually changes to legislation, because it's just voting fodder is how it seems at this moment in time. So I think in spirit there's some positive elements, and certainly we should have a scrutinising chamber. I mean, there are discussions about voting for people to be elected in that role, and I welcome that conversation.
Yeah, Labour's calling for a fully elected House, isn't it? We will hear from James, from Zack, and from Craig on that question in just a moment. It's 8:46.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Labour's Sir Keir Starmer here taking your calls. Kirst is in Gurrock in Scotland.
Where do you stand on the issue of the strikes with nurses?
I want to see this resolved. I want to see the government 19%? Around. I think 19% is more than can be afforded by the government, but I would get around the table and negotiate something that works for both sides.
Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, he said that we need to be aware that the NHS is a service, not a shrine, and the NHS, needs to reform or die. Do you concur?
Yeah, we've got to reform the NHS going forward.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. Cross Question on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:50 is the time. With me in the studio for Cross Questions, the Green Party's Deputy Leader for England and Wales, Zack Polanski, Conservative MP for Calder Valley, Craig Whittaker, Diary Editor of The Spectator, James Heale, and Luciana Berger, who, as well as being a former MP, is also now Chief Executive of In-House Communications. We were talking a moment ago about the House of Lords. James and Ayrshire asking whether there would be serious reform of the House of Lords. Zack Polanski, should there be? Will there be?
Well, I think this is one of the most important questions you can ask tonight. And I think often the public don't attune to questions about the House of Lords or about the voting systems that we use to elect people. But actually, all of these things are about how the country is run. So when we're talking about striking workers or homeless people, really how people represent us is at the core of that. And right now, we have a broken voting system of first past the post in this country. There's only 2 countries in Europe who use this system, the UK and Belarus, which is literally a corrupt dictatorship. So I think it's really time that we lose first past the post. And it's pretty dire that this Conservative government have taken us from proportional representation to first past the post. To the question, though, to the House of Lords. But my point really here is that Keir Starmer started talking about the House of Lords, but I think it's a big distraction. We need to be talking about
that's what the question was
proportional
about,
representation for House
That's
of
what
Commons.
the question was about. James and Ayrshire wants to know, will there ever be meaningful reform in the House of Lords?
We badly need meaningful reform in the House of Lords, and I'd look to abolish it in terms of having unelected bishops running the country and scrutinise things. Does not make sense. I think there is room for a scrutiny chamber, and I think there is good work happening in the House of Lords now, so it's not to kind of dismiss all the work that people
You'd
do.
have it wholly elected, or...?
Yeah, so I think wholly elected, and we could look at a proportional element, but I think all of those conversations need to come later, after you've gone to the House of Commons first and made sure you've got proportional representation for the House of Commons.
Craig Whittaker, do you think...
well, first of all, the biggest referendum we had in this country, the second biggest, was actually on AV, and the British public absolutely rejected it by 72% out. So,
which is good that it's not proportional.
Okay,
in fact, it results in
House of Lords reform.
So on House of Lords reform. On House of Lords reform. I don't think I've had one email, one conversation, one telephone call, one letter from any one of my constituents that say this should be a priority.
It's because you've not been on the picket lines.
Because I've not been on the picket lines, of course.
Sorry,
so in the mix of priorities, I can't see it happening forever. I know the Labour Party have said that they would put it in their manifesto and on their agenda, but in the priority of what needs to be done, I think it's very low down the list.
Do you think it does need reform, though?
I think it needs some form of reform. I go in swings and roundabouts on this one. I mean, like Luciana, when you work with Lords, the expertise that they have is you could never replicate under a voted system. And there, because you normally, if we're doing a health bill, you get all the health experts coming in. You get an education bill, you tend to get all the educationalists coming in, whatever it is. And I think that's a unique system. But it does need reforming. I think there's too many. I think at one time when the Lib Dems were looking at that in the coalition days, I think they were talking in the region of 300 working lords or something. Don't quote me on the figure, but whatever it was. So I think things like that, an age limit. I'm talking about working lords. There's nothing wrong with keeping a lord as a gong, as an honour, but from physical working lord in the House of Lords, I think we can do reform.
James Heale.
Well, I think Keir Starmer, when he announced these plans last week, was talking about people wanting to be empowered. And I think that we've discussed tonight a number of different crises facing the British state. I think people want to feel empowered by getting public services that work, rather than having a 2-year-long constitutional crisis, as this would be, using up huge amounts of political capital. And I think we've had a little bit tonight of how the difficulties of, you understand what the problem is, you know what the House of Lords issue is, it's undemocratic, fine, okay, how do you go and solve that? And that becomes the next debate. We talk about proportional reform, proportional representation. Well, if that is PR elected, that is in a bicameral system that is going to take power away from the House of Commons. And I'm yet to meet many MPs who are willingly going to give power away out of the chamber to someone else just down the corridor. I think, there was a good point that Craig was just talking about now about the expertise. Earlier we were discussing homelessness. John Bird, the founder of the Big Issue, is in the House of Lords a member, number of peers with disability issues, whole different range of expertise, and that will change forever. And the House of Lords will not give way so much the more that it becomes sort of an elected element, as we saw post-1999 with the House of Lords reforms. So it's a very difficult question, and I don't think any government has any really stomach for that, particularly after the last 5-6 years on the Brexit wars.
So you think, in short, no is the answer to the question?
I think that no, it won't happen, and I think it'll be more likely some small tweaks like the steel bill a few years ago.
James, what do you think?
I think there's a understanding of the structure of the United Kingdom, which is a union of 4 equal nation states. Reform of the House of Lords is an ability to actually have equal representation of 4 of these 4 nation states of the United Kingdom. Gordon Brown has some very good ideas around this.
OK, James, thank you for your question. That's James in Ayrshire. Let's go to Abdul in Leicester. Abdul, hi, what's your question?
Hi. First of all, before the question, is a quick one. On my condolences to the families of the 3 children who've sadly lost their lives.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I heartfelt condolences. It's heart-wrenching. But
Well said, Abdul.
as far as the foreign policy is concerned, I think it leaves much to be decided. I think we should stop meddling in other countries. Don't the panel think that, first of all, we should learn from Iraq, we should learn from Afghanistan. And at the same time, I don't say this, but even if we look at the IDF former soldiers who've left the IDF in Israel, they themselves say, many of them say that we
Abdul, what's your question, Abdul?
My question is, shouldn't we stop supporting people who are doing the oppressing in parts, like in Israel?
So less intervention in other parts of the world?
Yes, less intervention and less meddling where,
Okay, thank you. Abdul, going to come to the panel. Craig Whittaker, do we need to be a bit more focused on our own issues and less on other countries?
Look, the international stuff is incredibly important. We've had lots of discussions around foreign aid, for example, and how that's used over since I came in 2010, and prior to that as well. But in 2010, we've seen this huge debate around how that does. And actually, the soft power that gives us as a nation is immense. You talk about things like education for young girls. You talk about, I was in the Gambia earlier on in the year talking to the Gambian assembly members about domestic abuse and those types of things. So that soft power, even if it's like, putting that seed in there, helps change things for the better, and we know it also stops it stops terrorism. Helps stop terrorism, and education's a great thing, and we invest heavily around that, and that's basically our foreign policy.
This is after Foreign Secretary James cleverly, of course, today said that Britain needs to look beyond the comfort blanket of our traditional European and North American allies. Will that be contentious, James, do you think, or is that just common sense from the Foreign Secretary?
Well, it's common sense to an extent, but I think we're still yet to see any sort of meat on the bones. James Cleverly's been banging the drum, talking about doing more stuff with Africa. Fine, fantastic, but only a few months ago we had Foreign Secretary Liz Truss talking about a network of liberty. So I think it's much more about consistency. What I would say, just to go back on the original question, I think was the big foreign intervention of this year was, Ukraine and Britain's support there, and I'm not sure anyone in Westminster would be questioning that. I think obviously now we're sort of reaping the difficulties of that in terms of the energy costs we're feeling now, but yet still, I think across party in Westminster, 99% of MPs would support it, and so I'm not really sure when it comes to standing up against tyranny in Eastern Europe, we should be questioning that anytime soon.
Zach?
Yes, less intervention, I think, with exceptions. So I think Ukraine is an exception where the government were right to intervene and were right to arm the Ukrainians to be able to defend their country. I think a second aspect of this is actually the climate crisis, though. We know that a lot of these wars and conflicts that are happening are often about scarce resources. And actually, I think we need to live up to our global responsibilities around climate, make sure we're reducing our emissions and also building a resilient country ourselves, because ultimately we're going to see a lot more climate refugees as the years and decades go by, and actually that's going to cause increasing conflict in some of the areas of the world. So I think as little intervention as possible, but actually, yes, there are times when we need to get involved.
And lastly, Luciana.
I think we have a responsibility to play our part on the global stage. I think this country has a proud history of looking outwards, and not just to our European neighbours, but beyond that. I think there's some really important roles and responsibilities we can and should assume, and I would agree, most recently, kind of the role that we've played in supporting Ukraine has been, critical and has shown some leadership. That very serious issue continues. It's not in any way resolved, but we have a responsibility and we should live up to that responsibility. And I'd also agree when it comes to the climate crisis also that as a country we can't act in isolation, and particularly in the wake of Brexit. Again, we can't just rely on our European neighbours. We've got a role to look further afield. When it comes to intervening, there's a whole discussion about what that means, but I want us to be leaders on the global stage.
Abdul, thank you for your question. Our final text question comes from Alice in Plymouth. Alice says, poor Harry Kane missing that crucial penalty. What's the worst thing which has happened to you while a pretty large group of people have been watching? Who shall I put on the spot here first? Zack, go on.
So before I was in politics, I was an actor, and I can remember times on stage where you just write, and one time being in a Shakespearean play and having to make up 5 minutes of Shakespeare while several hundreds of people watch. So I think that was
How quickly did people realise that you were completely making it up?
I was about to say I think I pulled it off, but then I'm worried that reflects on me as a politician.
I'm sure someone realised that. James?
Well, mine's also football related, and I was school goalkeeper, and I was known as the Achilles heel for the week school. And I remember once committing a horrendous foul, and I sort of just punched a striker in the face and got sent off.
You punched a striker?
I was going for the ball, obviously, kind of thing.
I was the first person to ever get a red card for my school. All equally horrific, totally accidental, two-footed lunge and hit up. Luciana?
I used to have an involuntary shaky leg. When I would do public speaking. So my first time at the dispatch box in the House of Commons, I had to stand on my foot because it was shaking so bad.
To stand on your foot?
Yeah.
Great. Great.
So the colleagues could see behind, that I had this shaky leg.
Going back to school days for me, I remember being in a play and the teacher asked us to get up on stage and practice, and I was practicing singing badly, only to find out that the PA system around the whole school was switched on.
No, what were you singing?
It was Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat.
I hope there's a recording of that somewhere on file. We're going to do our best to uncover it. Thank you all very much. Zack Polanski of the Green Party, Tory MP Craig Whittaker, Luciana Berger, Chief Executive of In-House Communications, and James Heale from The Spectator. Thank you for your questions too. Coming up after the news, we're going to be talking a little bit more about an issue that we touched on with the panel, homelessness. As a cold snap hits the UK, what more needs to be done to help people who are on the street or in temporary accommodation? How big an issue is this? And as we were hearing, when we could tackle it during the pandemic with a little bit of political will, are we not giving enough attention to something perhaps should be treated as much more of a national emergency? That's next. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, school children and firefighters have been among dozens of people laying flowers at a lake near Birmingham, where 3 boys died. The boys, who were 8, 10 and 11, suffered cardiac arrests after falling through the ice in Solihull yesterday afternoon. A 4th boy is critically ill in hospital. Local Tory MP Saqib Bhatti visited it